want to very briefly welcome Daryl and Cathie Solomonson. Thank you so much for coming. Every year I have students fill out a survey at the end of the year about the most meaningful experiences in my class, and every year their names come up instead of anything I ever did in class. So I always wonder if I should be offended, but I'm not, because they have taught me more about the real experience of what it meant to be in Vietnam than anything I've ever read. So thank you so much for spending your time and revisiting a painful past. And if you might begin by explaining how you enlisted and doing more of the introduction of yourself.
So it's always a pleasure and actually a surprise to be invited to talk about our experiences, because as Vietnam vets, you may probably be aware that it was an unpopular war, and veterans who returned were pretty much either ignored or made to feel very unwelcome coming back. And so you learned to just keep quiet. It was very easy as a woman for anyone, to just disregard my experience, because most people didn't realize that there were even women in Vietnam. This year marks the 50th year for us since we got back from Vietnam. And that means that it's about the 55th year since we were your age. And I can still remember, believe it or not, what it was like to be 16, 17, and 18, and be trying to imagine what I would do with my life and how would I, spend my energy, and what would I pursue. So, and it was a very wonderful time in my life to be sorting those things out. So I appreciate how you're kind of in that same phase of your life. And for me, it was the experience of having met a physician who was a missionary doctor in Africa, who was looking for a cure for the tsetse fly disease. That was a sleeping sickness, that was an encephalitis that was causing a lot of problems in Africa. And he had found a cure for it, and he was telling stories about it. And that's kind of when I decided to go into nursing. But as the oldest daughter in my family, that's a very typical decision. Somehow, the oldest girls, are there oldest girls in families in the group? Yeah. They, not to make you feel like you have to be nurturing, but typically you sort of fall into that role as the oldest sibling and the oldest daughter to kind of take on that kind of responsibility in your family, whether you are aware of it or not. And so it's very common in a nursing class to find that most of the women, because nursing is still primarily a woman's profession, go into nursing. So the war was going on for a few years on the campus. They were protesting against it. We didn't have a ROTC group at my school. So, and I had younger brothers who were coming of age. One was actually 15 minutes younger, he was my twin. And so they were coming of age when they were going to be eligible for the draft. And so I was giving serious thought to that. And so my senior year, I decided to look at the military. There were a lot of things in nursing that had to do with sort of glamorizing, serving, helping soldiers. Florence Nightingale, who's considered an icon in nursing, had worked in the Crimea War, and there were lots of poems written about her, so they really romanticized it. And I was pretty naive. But I went to a couple of recruiters, and one of them said, if you sign up for a guaranteed assignment to Vietnam, you'll be able to displace your brother from going. And that seemed like a really good deal to me. And so I decided I would go in the Army. When I went to the Navy, they said, if you sign up to go into the Navy, you'll never have to take care of any patients at a bedside. You'll be managing corpsmen. And that did not sound like a good idea to me. I really wanted to be at the bedside. So I signed up.
Thank you. Real quick, I was in college and I like to ski. So I was out skiing out in Colorado. I'm in my third year, and so I missed a quarter, the draft board, and the school had turned me into the draft board. I got drafted. I had two options: become an enlisted man or go to Officer Candidate School. I chose the latter. Went to Officer Candidate School down at Fort Benning, Georgia. Became a second lieutenant. And just to give you a quick stat, my class was 89 lieutenants. 48 of them died in the first year of Vietnam. So it just was really not a nice place to be as a lieutenant. Anyway, that's how I got to Vietnam. And you want me to continue from there, or do you want to? I actually arrived in Vietnam. I was 23 years old. I was a company commander. I had 375 guys and ladies working for me. I was in the middle of a war zone. I commanded a tactical unit. And you want to know what it feels like to step on the ground and look at these people in the eye and say, you know, I'm 4 years older than most of you at that time. And think about the responsibility about that. And then you're going to this land where there are no roads and maps like you have around Huntersville and so on. Anyways, it's just, it was a awakening experience for me. And then just another quick statistic about most everybody that died in Vietnam, most everybody, was between the ages of 18 and 22. So that's just another statistic. And there were about 68,000 young people that died. That's the size of Huntersville, just to give you a comparison. I'm going to throw out a couple other things before I go into some of the questions that you have, but there are 1.2 million Vietnam vets being treated by the Veterans Administration today. 1.2 million. I mentioned there were 58,000 that died. 60,000 plus live on the streets of our country today. Over 65,000 have committed suicide today. So there's some things about the war. It's not glamorous. I'll get into the rest of it.
Yeah.
It's not glamorous.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So the Army allows you to be commissioned in the Nurse Corps once you have completed and passed your nursing boards, your licensing boards. So I went off to San Antonio, which is where they have their medical field service school where it's supposed to prepare you for Army life. And so I inquired as to, now that I was actually in the Army, how did I arrange for my brothers not to go to Vietnam. And they informed me that the recruiter had not been accurate, and that the Sullivan Act only applied to boy babies. It didn't apply to the sisters or any women in the family. So by that time, I had been working at Fort Sam waiting for my orders for Vietnam, and I was taking care of Vietnam vet returnees. And I thought, well, this is something I feel I can do, and I wanted to do so. It turned out that my brother and I were both stationed in Vietnam at the same time. He was in a construction battalion as a Navy medic, and he was stationed about 6 miles away from where I was stationed in Vietnam, and I could climb the water tower at night on my installation and see flares going off over his installation. But we would get together from time to time when we didn't have a whole lot of days off, but when they coincided, we would do MedCaps together, and we would, MedCap is a medical civilian action program, and we would set up basically sick call in villages and work together on that. In preparing for Vietnam, the Army would have us go through a lot of different classes, and there were pretty large groups that were going through these classes. And so one of them was about all the Army terminology, and another one was about how to dress like or how to put on makeup like a female officer should put on makeup. And there was this woman that gave a talk about how we should be arching our eyebrows. We should be plucking our eyebrows and having the arch come right in the middle of where our pupils were. I mean, we're sitting there like we're wearing combat, boots and fatigues, and we're talking about this. And so then the next segment was called the Goat Lab. And I understand that shortly after we went through the Goat Lab, a group of protesters who were called anti-vivisectionists closed down the Goat Lab. But basically what they did was they anesthetized goats, and they shot each of the goats in their shoulders and hindquarters. And then we bound up, and we were supposed to breed these anesthetized goats. We had to wear sterile gloves, like they were worried about infection or something, but we had to identify the difference between an entrance wound and an exit wound in soft tissue and muscle tissue, and be able to debride it and close it properly. And that was my first sense that this is pretty serious stuff. If they are sacrificing these poor goats for our education, this is going to be some pretty heavy stuff. But, we still weren't so heavy into all of that someone didn't whisper under their breath, "Do you think these goats care about the shape of our eyebrows?" So there was still a sense of some disparity between what we were being taught and what we thought we were going to be going through. So when I got to Vietnam, we landed, and I was wearing the summer uniform, which is a seersucker skirt, green and white stripe, and a top, nylons, and patent leather high heels. That's what they had us ride in on the plane. And the plane ramp, the stairs that we took out of the plane, was like this open meshwork. So it was really hard to get down the stairs in these high heels. And the Benoit airfield was under attack. So we had to make this mad dash across the airfield in our shorts, these pencil thin skirts, high heels into the bunkers. And we just thought, somebody has just not got this figured out well for us. But we still, nobody got hurt, so we still saw sort of the humor in it to some extent. While we were there, the chief nurse for all of the area came in, and she said, "How many of you volunteered specifically for Vietnam?" And in this group of about 30 people, all but 2 of us raised our hand. This was what we asked for. And so my roommate from college had asked for a guaranteed assignment to San Francisco, to Letterman General. And 3 months later, when she landed in Vietnam, they asked the same question: "How many of you volunteered for Vietnam as your first assignment?" And only 2 out of the group actually raised their hand. So all the others, even though they had not been drafted, they had been guaranteed assignments, but with no specific length to that guarantee. So they all ended up in Vietnam too. So they offered us any place that we wanted to go, because they had a lot of openings, because the troop levels were really building up. It was just after Tech, and they were worried about the increase in casualties and combat problems. So I asked for the hospital that had neurosurgery because I was interested in that. And so I was assigned to a neurosurgical ward where they had spinal cord injuries and head injuries.
And that'll bring us to how did we meet, okay? I was running a tactical area of responsibility south of Long Beach, which was kind of a major headquarters. And we had about, we lived in villages, and our guys lived in these little outposts to protect the villages, and we were protecting them against the Viet Cong. And that was our job, both on land and on water. So we had a river rats group that we called that actually patrolled the rivers, and we had combat guys that worked all night long and during the day protecting these villages. And there was about maybe 6,000 to 7,000 people that were in the 5 or 6 villages that we were responsible for. So we had an engineering unit that was responsible for putting in electricity into some of our outposts and into the village. And one of my very dear friends is a lieutenant in the engineer corps named David Cass, got attacked while he was putting in electricity with his unit, and he was medevaced out of my unit or area to the 24th Evac Hospital, i.e. to her ward. So I came in to visit David, and he's on a striker frame. And if you've ever seen a striker frame, it's kind of weird. I mean, the guy's stretched from end to end, and they rotate him every couple hours. So, and then I could only visit him when he was down, obviously. I couldn't get up to look at him because he's up high. So I'm under David, and I'm saying, David, how you doing? And he says, Daryl, I need a beer. And I said, I don't know if you can have a beer. So I went and I said, I'll be right back. And I went up to the nurse, Cathie, and I said, can David Cass have a beer? And she looked at me and smiled. She said, only if you buy beer for all of my patients. I said, deal. Most of her patients were unconscious. But, anyway, that's how we met. And then we started dating, and I can give you a little time on that.
So, Daryl found out who I was dating, and he threw a party, and he invited the fellow I was dating to come and, bring a guest, knowing it would be me. And then he set the table so that he sat between us the whole night.
This is a very small hooch, by the way.
Okay. So I have to say in advance that this seems to kind of resonate with the young men in the audience every year because, we'll get notes saying, that was really a smooth move, Mr. Solomonson. So, and I do want to skip forward just a little bit. David, came back to the States. He did have some residual damage to his spinal cord, but he went on to become the civil engineer for the town he's in. He did all the surveying. He used to send me emails once a week with the names of the 2 or 3 books on history that he had just finished that week. Just devoured books, and it was so fascinating. Fathered 4 children, wonderful kids, and became a scuba diver. I mean, he has had a very, very full life. He's starting to have some additional issues with his spinal column, but he's still a very vibrant, interesting human being and fun to be with. So we went to visit him this past October, and we did not realize that it was 50 years to the week of his initial injury. So, yeah. So it was kind of wonderful to see him and spend time with him. And he's learning how to drive a car with some adapted pieces so that he can use his hands instead of his feet for control. So he's still learning and still trying to be productive. So, besides taking care of our forces. We also took care of all the Allied forces. We took care of civilians because we did create casualties from, fire that was not intended to hurt civilians. And we also took care of a group called Detainees of a Conflict. Vietnam was never a declared war. It was called a conflict. So they couldn't be labeled as prisoners of war. They had to be detainees of a conflict. And sometimes it was very difficult to identify them immedially, in a situation where you have a lot of people that are wounded, unable to tell you anything about themselves. And they weren't wearing a lot of ID. If they were part of the group called Viet Cong, they didn't have any ID whatsoever because it was a very kind of stealth operation at night. They typically went home from their day jobs and put on black silky pajamas and came out into the villages and different compounds and worked to what in activities that they saw were protecting their country from invaders, because a great many of them saw us as not belonging there and not particularly helpful to them. So sometimes someone would come through surgery and they would come out of anesthesia and they would do something called chu hoi. They would put their hands up to the sky, and that would be the first time that we would realize that we had an enemy combatant on our ward, and we would have to put them in, as you can imagine, if you're a GI and you're in bed next to someone who is doing a chu hoi, you would have pretty strong feelings about what you'd want to do. So we would move the chu hoi patients into a separate room where they would be guarded by the MPs, and then they would go to a separate hospital on our same compound and be cared for there. When we cared for really small children, usually it was typically that they might have gotten a piece of shrapnel in their head, and that's why they would be on our ward. It didn't matter what other injuries that they had. If there was a head injury or a spinal cord injury, we took care of them in Vietnam. So we would have these little babies, and that was when I discovered something really surprising to me, that music is not the universal language that we think it is. That the scale of music in Vietnam was not the same as the one we were used to, so that we would be singing lullabies to these small children and trying to rock them to sleep, and it had absolutely no effect. And sometimes families would come in and they would actually, they travel great distances, so they would sleep around the child's bed, right on the ward. And it was a pretty rustic environment. It was cement floors and corrugated metal roofs. And but we would hear the mothers singing, and they would be going, and so we thought, well, I guess that's what we need to do to get these kids to sleep when the mothers aren't here. And so we would have to try to imitate the sounds of a much different musical scale. And sure enough, the kids would go to sleep. And it was like, for me, it was this wonderful insight into not making assumptions about what other people enjoy or what works to soothe them, or what their cultural their whole cultural environment is. That in order to really be of assistance, you really have to get to know where they're coming from and try to do away with your own preset ideas about what works.
I asked a bunch of questions. One of them was, what's the most important or impactful experience you had in Vietnam? I had to pick up one of my men's legs, both of them. He was severed at his hip. His name is P.F.C. Bernetti, and I put him on a helicopter with him, and they took him as a medevac back. Yeah. Bernetti, Jim, is still alive. He went through surgery. They cut amputated both his legs right here. He lost his left arm and his right eye. He raised a family on a ranch, Kumbaya Ranch in Santa Barbara, California. You can still look that up. I think he's still associated with that. He was teaching handicapped kids how to ride horses, this guy. He went through lots of drug abuse, lots of problems. He got married, had 3 beautiful kids, but no legs, 1 arm, and he still survived. And he still survives today. He drives across the country from California on Memorial Day. He has a tent that's on the wall, if you're ever there, and it's called the mission it's a ministries for Vietnam vets. Anyways, that's the most memorable thing. It's the heaviest thing I've ever lifted in my life. And the other experience that I had is on the other question you had, did you ever meet any Vietnamese people and have a relationship with them? And the answer is yes. And Jean Mui, who was a village chief and a district chief, basically hosted Cathie and I at his house. I had a lot of my men guarding the house. And he hosted us when we got engaged in Vietnam on New Year's Eve in 1969. He did not get out of Vietnam, but his son did, and some of his family. And they owned a dry cleaning up in Kapitsky, New York. So they did get out after the war, but or during the end of the war. But those are a couple of questions you had. I know we're getting close to questions. Cathie, you want to cover a couple of things else on the list? Or your list?
I think the experience for me in Vietnam that I found most distressing, and it was a year of a lot of painful memories, but our hospital was located right across a dirt road from a stockade, which was used to jail Americans who had been found guilty of going AWOL or using drugs or other infractions that the military was holding them prior to their being usually sent back to the States to have trials. So they were usually more serious infractions than would just be, we're demoting you 1 pay grade. And it was called Long Bin Jail, so it was abbreviated as LBJ. So one night, there was this huge commotion at the stockade. And I could look out from where I lived in a little Quonset hut. And the whole place was on fire. There were sirens and there were helicopters circling with lights and everything. And what had happened was the prisoners in the stockade had started to riot against the cadre, the guards, and they had taken apart their bunk beds, and they had used them as weapons, and they had both sides just been basically beating up on each other for hours. So since our hospital was the closest, we got all the patients in. On my ward, we got all of the head injuries, and there were a lot. And so one side of the ward had the guards bandaged from head to toe, and right across where their foot of their bed, there was a short walkway, and then right across there was the other half that were the prisoners that had also been beaten up badly. And actually all the wards, the orthopedic wards, were full of patients with broken bones that were cadre and prisoners. And I think for me that was the lowest point in the whole war, because I thought, we can't even get along ourselves. We're beating each other up at a time that we're in a country, with the intent of teaching democracy, of imposing a form of government on another country. I mean, they supposedly asked us to be there, but it was like, I think it just took everything out of me that day to just keep caring, because I just wanted to go back and weep for humanity and for its inability to deal with conflict and to deal with other issues. And so that for me was the worst memory from being in Vietnam.
I want to just comment on a couple of things. I was 20 miles away, and we were fighting the VC that night in a very ugly battle, and they're fighting in the prison right across the street from the hospital that my guys were going to. It was crazy. You asked about the war. I landed after being there for 2 weeks. I said, basically, what the hell are we doing here? I mean, it was so obvious that the water buffalo and the farmers wanted to just grow their rice and produce their products. They had no intentions of wanting to fight us in the villages. The VC had a larger political desire to get their country back. Didn't really understand all of that until Cathie and I actually watched the series on the Vietnam War by Ken Burns. It's on Netflix. It's 8 hours. It's a long time. But it'll tell you the whole story and how much our government, in my mind, betrayed us with information. We never understood where things were and why we were doing it. You had a question about coming back and protesting. I did not. I did not protest until Iraq. So, you know, because I could see us doing the same thing again. The government lying about us going to Iraq, do something which was totally incorrect. And I knew that because that's the business I was in. So I really had a lot of distrust for things that went on in Vietnam. I came home to a very healthy family, and I didn't get treated very badly at all in my little town, Minneapolis. So anyways, that was some of that. You want to, Leslie, I know that you're pushing on time.
Right, this is a good time to have some questions.
I just have one more. So one of the questions was, what do we carry back from Vietnam? And I know it's more of an abstract thing that you carry back, but this is actually a very material thing that I carried back from Vietnam. I don't know if you can see it. It's, when I went to Vietnam, my roommate gave me this. It's a figure of Don Quixote, you know, from, at the time there was a play called Fantastics that was based on it. And it was, you know, to a man from La Mancha, I mean. And it's, he was the Spanish character who fought at windmills. You know, you eventually get to read him. But there's a line from it, you know, to dream the impossible dream, to fight the impossible fight, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And so going in, I sort of felt some of that going back. I just thought I would have been willing to give up everything that I learned about caring for patients if it meant there hadn't been war. I mean, I grew a lot in terms of my understanding of helping people, but I think I probably would have learned that much in the trauma unit back in the States. And so for me, one of the characteristics that's considered kind of primary when you meet a Vietnam vet is that they have a very healthy distrust of authority figures. So, okay, we'll go to questions. Yeah.
Does anyone have a question? The Solomonsons would love to answer any questions that have come to your minds.
Don't be afraid. Okay, good. Good.
Ms. Bragg said that you were instrumental in the creation of the monument, the Ranch's monument. Can you tell us a little about
Yes, thank you. Some of you, how many of you have been and visited Washington, D.C. and seen the Vietnam Veterans Memorial? You've seen the wall, which I think is wonderful. I love it. At the time time that it was built, part of the fundraising was falling short, and in order to get enough funds, they had to agree to put up a realistic statue of 3 fighting men. And the statue was created by an artist known as Rick Hart. And he said at the time that there was no way that he could have included a woman in that grouping. So the women that were there felt, the wall by itself was complete, but once you start putting up realistic representation of Vietnam vets and you don't include women, we felt that that was an omission. So we began petitioning for the right to place something that would be representational that women had served there also. And it took about 8 years to get permission and raise the money. There were a lot of design arguments against some earlier designs, and eventually we ended up with the memorial as it is, which is a grouping of 3 nurses holding an injured soldier. And by that time, I think people had begun to understand when you first recognize that you need to heal, that you have issues that you need to work through, you tend to look to people who you see like yourself, who you think have had, similar experiences that you trust. So we felt like, well, the men were the primary movers for the wall, and so in their healing stages, they were pretty early on. They didn't look to other people other than other men. But we were farther along, so, we included a male in our grouping, even though he's injured. And I can tell you that the artist, Glenn Goodacre, has been asked, one of my favorite parts of the grouping is one of the nurses is standing and she has her hand tucked back on the elbow of another nurse and she's looking up to the heavens. And they asked Glenn what was she looking for? And Glenn said, as any good artist would, it's really up to the person who's viewing it to interpret it the way they want. But she thought, in her mind, that the nurse was looking for divine intervention. And she said, if you want to think they're looking for the medevac helicopter, that's all right too. But we also put together a resource that's called a Sister Search list where people can write in if they're looking for women who served in Vietnam. And we send the letter, if we know the person that they're looking for, we send the letter out to that person and say, this person is looking for you. We don't automatically give that name out because a lot of people still want to protect their privacy about their tenure.
Yes, sir.
How was the transition from military life to civilian?
Well, I guess we both can do that. It was kind of nice for us because we got out of the military and we got married the first time. That's another story. Anyway, you're laughing. Anyways, we've been married twice to each other. So, anyways, but we had Chad and Jason, our 2 wonderful sons. They live here in this area, and their wives and 4 grandsons. I think you know Bowden. Probably know Emily if she used to play soccer here. But anyway, but really, I moved on pretty easily. Okay, I had a lot of stuff to get rid of, and I got rid of it. And I had a lot of nice family around us, and Cathie and I had a really joyous time, for the first few years that we really went out to California and kind of explored, and got, it was a wonderful time for us. So, but the protesting here in the United States was going on very strong then also, and I realized that the protesting didn't happen on the Iraq War as much because we had a draft back then, and everybody had to go. Every community was touched by those 58,000 dead and 300,000 wounded. Everybody was touched by that, so there was a big a lot of people wanting to stop that war. Iraq, it's all volunteer army. We kind of just let them go. It's not, I don't know, how many people know someone serving in the military right now? Oh, good. Excellent. Anyways, there aren't that many from everybody's neighborhood across the country anymore. So that's, it wasn't a big protest. I protested personally because I didn't want to see these young men and women go to another war like Vietnam. And that's exactly what it was. Go ahead, Karen.
My transition, I got back to the States and I was aware of, I was having language difficulties. I hadn't used a huge chunk of my vocabulary in over a year. So that words like fluorescent or asphalt or curb, it was like having what's called an expressive aphasia. I couldn't find the word easily because it wasn't in my short-term memory. So I would stutter and I just felt very awkward that way. There were also certain sounds that would trigger automatic reflexes that I had to unlearn. My brother Tim, who was the Navy medic, and I happened to be home at the same time after Vietnam. And we live in this little village and it has a siren that goes off at noon to test so that they know that it alerts all the volunteer firemen when it's not noon, that they have to gather to get on the engine and go to wherever the fire is. Well, we were both under the kitchen table with our heads down and our hands, tucked behind our necks. In a matter of seconds, we still had that autonomic response just to duck when we hear a siren. So obviously there weren't any incoming, so we were okay. And but we looked at each other and we realized that we were going to have to deal with a lot of that. But probably the most difficult part for me was relating to people on the more everyday, superficial things that used to just be part of kind of pop culture in our lives. And it was hard for me to have discussions about fairly, what to me was sort of almost silly. Now I'm fine with being silly. And it was a little more difficult because I still carried a certain silliness or a certain seriousness about it. And one of the most difficult things actually was, it said we were going to get married and I had to go find a wedding dress. And I had been wearing combat fatigues and combat boots for a year. And every time I would go and put on something white and lacy, I felt ridiculous. It was like, this just is so bizarre. And I couldn't do it. I mean, I would put it on and it just didn't feel right. Nothing felt right. So, sorry, is that okay?
Yeah, that's excellent. I know you're very appreciative of the Solomonsons, so thank you so much.